Hello, hello. Today is Fun Friday, September 27th, and welcome to episode 365 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Morgan Vigna, and I'm joined today by NSI's Deputy Executive Director Martha Miller and my fellow Senior Fellows Lester Munson and Jeffrey Wells. Today, we are talking about the 2024 UN General Assembly and UN High Level Week, which is just wrapping up in New York. Topics dominating the week's agenda were the war in Ukraine and the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, climate change, artificial intelligence, and nuclear proliferation, not to mention the horrendous traffic jams. On Tuesday, after welcoming those present to Washington, President Biden focused his last remarks in front of the UN General Assembly on recapping his administration's foreign policy and touting his sad legacy in Washington. Unlike last year, France's President Francois Macron and the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Keir Starmer were actually present. I'll note that last year, Macron and former UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak were no-shows, citing that they had better things to do. Notably absent, but not entirely surprising, given they have never really shown up to begin with, were Russian President Vladimir Putin and China's Xi Jinping, who are instead represented by their foreign ministers. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky spoke before the UN General Assembly on Wednesday, and President Netanyahu is actually scheduled to speak today. Zelensky also made a stop in Washington, meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris and President Biden at the White House, as well as members of the Senate. He also meets today with former President Trump. So, questions today. Les, I'm going to start with you, and it's a two-parter. The United Nations was created with the very broad and ambitious agenda of maintaining world order. As we see today, the UN and more specifically the UN Security Council are floundering when it comes to maintaining world order, solving the most intractable challenges. But my big question here is two questions, as I mentioned, this is a two-parter. Is the UN even equipped to do this? Is it relevant anymore to actually completing its original mission? But B, do we even want it to, given the toxicity of the global world order? So let's go.
Morgan, we are a fallen species. We are imperfect. We have problems. We have always had problems. We are always going to have problems. There is no utopia out there waiting for us. To answer your questions, I think the UN has been very disappointing in its performance. And the purpose of the UN is an admirable one, to provide for the world order and defend nation states and its members from offensive military actions. That's not happening in Ukraine. That's not happening with respect to Israel and southern Lebanon, where UN resolutions are being ignored by Hezbollah, and everyone seems to have forgotten about them. And it's also failing, frankly, in Haiti, where an entire country is dissolving before our eyes, and the UN seems to be unable to do anything. And I think if you're, and my point would be, if you are of a foreign policy advocate on the left, and you think collective action is important and that the international community can act in concert, well, folks, step up and make it work. The Biden administration, and if there is a Harris administration, stop letting the UN fail. Put some effort into this. We need to get this thing fixed and back performing functional tasks in the world order that are in our interests and in accord with our values. And I haven't seen that coming from this administration. It's been rather lax, frankly. And I worry, without any real pressure from our system, that a Harris administration would probably be even worse on the score. So I think the UN can play a very important role. I think if you didn't have the UN, we would need something exactly like it. But it's on the US government, and particularly the president right now, to make it work. And so far, he hasn't been doing that.
Jeffrey, is the UN relevant? Yes or no?
No. It has failed to live up to its original idea. It has never achieved, I shouldn't say never, but it's not achieving anything that it was originally designed for. And I'd say that it's even in its original design, it was kind of a patriarchal model to, in post World War II, to still give the big powers the power at the table to make all the decisions, while making the rest of the world feel like they're part of a conversation. And I'd say that, throughout, if we go through Korea on, to Rwanda, to Somalia, to Kosovo, to current day Haiti, Bangladesh, Ukraine, from a security perspective, it just continues to fail. So the big powers do whatever they want, and there is no consequence. If it is to be effective, it needs strong reformation, and it needs to have representation on the set of permanent members. Maybe we expand the permanent members. I don't have the answer, but is that we need to have sort of the global South represented as permanent members, and somebody that is willing to actually make the organization achieve something. Now, from a humanitarian perspective, yeah, they have done some good things, and from the health perspective, they're still relevant. But from a world security perspective, they're not. And the U.S., it's a great place to go and talk. People get heard. I guess it's like a podcast. But it's really just continue. You even see it today with Netanyahu's speech. It's just a place to come and let the world hear what you have to say, and then nothing really happens. Everybody walks away. New York is disrupted for 2 weeks. Everybody walks away, and the world goes on to continue to crumble at the edge. And there is no leadership. And I hope the next administration, is, again, the UN is not our organization, but that we invest in it and really try to create some concrete changes for the future that represent where the world is today, because it's much different. Although there are some similarities to the 40s and 50s when it was created, we're in a much different place, and we need stronger leadership and more effective, I'd say, enforcement of actions.
Yeah. So, Martha, one of my big frustrations with the UN is its moral corruptness of many in its membership. Many member states, the baddies in particular, get a world stage to tout falsehoods and at times blatant anti-Semitism, specifically directed towards Israel. I mean, look, you served in government. You've been tracking multilateralism for a while now. Like, what's your take?
I think to follow on both what Lester and Jeffrey have said, the United Nations has unfortunately become a bit of a caricature of sorts. It's the selective moral outrage only serves to undermine its credibility, turning a blind eye to dictatorships while obsessively focusing on democracies who are trying to defend themselves, particularly Israel. I mean, Israel continues to face a disproportionate condemnation at the United Nations for defending itself against terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. This is actually, unfortunately, not a new phenomenon at the United Nations. This sort of thing, negative focus on Israel has been going on for decades, really since its inception. In the meantime, look at China, who has a permanent seat on the Security Council. Its treatment of Uyghurs, basically re-education camps, and if you can even call it that, some people might call it gulags or concentration camps even, have been going on now for years. And despite credible reports about this, the UN has failed to take action. So what credibility can an organization have when its very leadership on the Security Council is engaged in such practices?
Yeah.
And that's just one of many examples we could go through, but our podcast, would need to be a longer format for us to go through all that.
Yeah, I think Les has advocated for a significantly longer podcast that has been vetoed by Jamil to read too often. Look,
much like the UN.
Yeah, there we go. Who voted that Jamil gets to be a permanent member?
He's a permanent member with a voice.
Yeah, he's
that
not on this
6
podcast
votes
anymore, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
All right, y'all. Well, look, I mean, Martha, Les, Jeffrey, I completely agree with so many of the challenges and the faults that have been mentioned here about the United Nations. I will say, which I know is surprising for me, that I think some of the things that the UN bodies, subsidiaries, funds, and programs actually do well. I mean, the World Food Program, for example, wouldn't exist without us, right? We give the bulk of funding to that organization. We actually have a ton of influence as to where that money goes. UNICEF, and many other organizations that vaccinate children and really help those, whether they're refugees or internally displaced people. Those organizations, I think, are ones in which, yes, they are needed in reform. They are many of them are dysfunctional, but at the same time, though, the United States has a large amount of influence to be able to put those dollars to good use and actually help the world's most vulnerable. I would also note that the number of specialized technical bodies and agencies, such as ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ITU, the Universal Postal Union, for goodness sakes, these are technical bodies that actually serve a purpose. And so I think when we think about how broken the UN system is when it comes to the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, yes, there's so much to complain about and bemoan. At the same time, there are some of these smaller bodies that actually serve a purpose and actually do their job effectively. So with that, and I don't think they're given a platform,
Morgan,
the international stage. So
before we end, can I just quickly associate myself with Jeffrey and his opposition to patriarchy earlier on in the podcast? I'm completely with him.
That's a wrap. Thanks to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, Alice Roosevelt, and the NSI staff for their helping in producing today's episode. Join us again on Monday, September 30th for our next episode of Fault Lines. Fault Lines is now on YouTube, so check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you liked what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.